Before I came to Central New York to be a priest, I served a parish in West Virginia. And while I was in West Virginia, we got a new bishop, an assisting bishop. We had Bishop Mike, who was like the bishop. And then we got this other bishop, Bishop Mark, which was a little confusing at first. But so Bishop Mark came to be our assistant bishop. And Bishop Mark was a really interesting and remarkable guy. I liked him quite a bit. Before he became the assistant bishop in West Virginia, he had been a bishop in Mozambique in southern Africa. But he wasn't from Mozambique. He was actually from Michigan, of all places. And he had gone there to Mozambique to work for an NGO doing development work. And he had grown up as a Methodist, and it was while he was in Mozambique that he converted to the Anglican Church, and he felt a call to become a priest, and so they sent him to England to go to seminary and be ordained, and he came back and served as a priest in Mozambique and eventually became the bishop. And he was there for a number of years before he felt a sort of a call to come home to the U.S., which he did, to become our assistant bishop. Now he's actually the bishop in Lexington, Kentucky these days. But so he came to West Virginia, and when I met him, Bishop Mark, he's kind of a tall guy. I had this uncanny sense of his familiarity. Like I feel like I had met him somewhere before. He seemed really familiar to me. And probably some of you had this experience where you meet someone for apparently the first time, but they seem like you know them from something. They seem familiar to you. And we talked about it, and our lives had never intersected at any point. I lived in Zimbabwe, which is next door to Mozambique, but we were never in the same place at the same time. And I was in England for a while, but not when he was in seminary. And so our lives had never crossed paths. But I just had this uncanny sense that I knew him from somewhere. His face was really familiar. And then one year we were doing the animal blessing for St. Francis, and I used to have this garden statue of St. Francis, Frank, we called him. And so I pulled out Frank to do the animal blessing, and I'll be darned if it wasn't Frank that looked exactly like Bishop Mark. He was the twin of my St. Francis statue. And so I'd been looking at the statue every day because it was right by the front door, and that's who Bishop Mark looked like. And so I took a picture and I sent it to him so he could see that this is who I knew. I actually knew him as St. Francis. Now I have, actually my St. Francis statue kind of sadly fell apart, so I'm in need of a new one at the moment. But St. Francis is really popular, right? He's one of our most popular saints, right? If you go up to the Marcellus Nursery on Onondaga Road, they have lots of statues of St. Francis. They don't have any statues of St. Swithin or St. Boris or St. Gleb, but they got lots of St. Francis statues. And he is one of sort of the top tier of saints who have broken through into popular culture, right? That everybody has heard of St. Francis. And you see his statue everywhere. People have him in his garden, usually with like a little deer and a little bird and a little water bowl, right? You all know what the statue looks like. He's really popular. In fact, but of the really super popular saints, he's really the only one that still is primarily connected to the life of the church, right? Because the other ones like St. Nicholas, well, St. Nicholas has kind of broken the bonds of his religious origins, and now he's an old guy who lives at the North Pole and delivers gifts, right? And then we have St. Patrick, who was a wonderful saint who did many great things, but apparently the only miracle we can think of today is that he turned beer green, which I'm pretty sure he never actually did. But like when I lived in Chicago, they would dye the whole river green, which is really, really bad for the river, I'm thinking. But anyway, so instead of St. Patrick's Day being sort of a day of holy devotion, it's pretty much the opposite of that. It's sort of a devotion to something else, not quite so holy. But St. Francis is still connected to this sense of the holy, of the divine, of the life of Christ. And he's really the only one in that top tier who still is. And I think it's because St. Francis had this reverence for creation, right? That Francis was someone who was dedicated to sharing the gospel message and living it out in real and meaningful ways. Right? That St. Francis himself is actually a really interesting person. He grew up very wealthy. He was the son of a lord in the city where he lived in Italy. He grew up in Italy in the 13th century. And Francis's dream as a boy was to grow up and be a military hero. He wanted to be a great soldier. But Francis wasn't really a very good soldier. He didn't have a lot of success in that realm. And one day he was coming back from some sort of military adventure, and he's up on his big horse, and he's wearing his fine clothes and his beautiful cloak. And at the city gates was this beggar. And Francis had this like sort of vision of Christ, this epiphany. And he gets down off of his horse and he interacts a little bit with the beggar, and he takes off his fine cloak, literally taking the clothes off his back, and gives it to the beggar. And this was an important change in his life, and he felt that this was a call that he had to serve the poor and the needy and to share this gospel good news. And so that's what he started to do, and he started by basically stealing things from his father and giving them away. And his dad wasn't so keen on that plan, and so there were some issues there. So Francis went off on his own, and the first sort of public thing he did was he found this church in the countryside, and it was in kind of poor repair. It was kind of fallen down a little bit. And so he took it upon himself to begin rebuilding this church. And people noticed, and they caught his enthusiasm and his sense of hope and his optimism, and they began to help him. And people became attracted. They wanted to be like Francis, and young men began to gather. So he started a holy order, like monks. And he was dedicated to poverty. And some of them weren't as dedicated to poverty as Francis was. And Francis wasn't very interested, really, in running a holy order. He was happy just to be the inspiration. So he kind of went off and did his own thing. But one of the things I think is really remarkable about Francis is that Francis lives in Italy in like the 13th century, when literally almost everywhere in Italy is controlled by the Pope. Right? Like he was like the king of Italy, the Pope. Right? That this is the heart of Christendom. And yet even in this place where theoretically the Christian faith has infiltrated at every level of society, Francis still felt that there was a call to share the gospel. I mean, we would think that in this place, of all places and in all times, the gospel would be so well known that there was no need to share it. And yet Francis saw that it was in sore need of being shared. That the faith that was present didn't penetrate very deep. And so Francis's mission was to share this gospel story in a new way and to connect it to the beauty of the creation that's all around us. And the reason we bless animals is he had several prayers that kind of speak to this, and he had a famous episode where he apparently preached a sermon to a flock of birds. And so he has this reverence for all life and all creation that people just responded to. In fact, there's a saying of Francis, although there's a lot of debate whether he actually said it, which many of you have heard, which is that at all times we should share the gospel. And if necessary, we should use words. Right? By which he means that our lives should be a kind of evangelism, that being the people we are shows our commitment to the way of Christ. Right? And that in our actions, in our choices, in our words, that we live into what we think of as our baptismal promises, to love the Lord with our whole heart and to see others as worthy of dignity. And I think that's why Francis remains really popular, because there's something really pure about him. It's not obscured by issues of doctrine or the issues that happen in the church. It's not connected with the ways the church has fallen short of its own vision. That there is something pure and beautiful about Francis that shows us an example, a life that's possible for us. And so we've come today and we come to celebrate that, and we celebrate the whole of creation, because one of the things that Francis saw, and that probably most of us hopefully understand, is that our lives can't live apart from everything else. That we are wholly dependent upon the abundance of creation for our very lives. That we can't live in a place that doesn't provide all of the things that our earth provides. And that our fate, our lives, are inextricably linked with the creatures and the creation that's all around us. That we are called to be stewards of that creation. And we live in a time when our ways have begun to challenge the very life-giving nature of the creation in which we live. And where we are called to make difficult choices, hard choices, to live in a new and sustainable way in harmony, which is very much what Francis was preaching 1,000 years ago. And so our call as Christian people is to be reminded of this creation that we are called to care for, and to live out our lives in such a way that other people can get the message without our even having to say it. And they might be inspired to join us in working to heal the creation, to restore the goodness with which God made it. So today we celebrate the glorious gifts of God that created us and sustain us, and are reminded of our call to preserve it and to pass it on. And that the gospel isn't about getting people to go to church. The gospel is about transforming lives to build a heavenly kingdom. Amen.